Story 1. My grandmother is from a small town of Ixtapan del Oro, a place that is after Valle de Bravo. That's where she fell in love with my grandfather, and at first they had 2 daughters, obviously one younger than the other, one of whom would be my aunt and the other is my mother. They were poor people since they lived in a place where there wasn't many resources. In those times, they used straw mats as beds. They had a mat for each baby and they all slept in the same room. Shortly after they fell asleep around 4 in the morning, the babies began to cry. They say that witches use some type of powder to put parents or people in the house to sleep. One of the children's cries was so loud that a neighbor heard and went to see what was happening. She came to my grandparents' house and started shouting, but they didn't answer. The worried woman started banging on the door, shouting at them that they needed to wake up. With great effort, my grandmother was able to wake up my grandfather. She heard that a baby was crying, but she couldn't see anything. Back then they didn't have electricity. She told my grandfather to look for some matches and light some candles. My frightened grandfather, after much struggling, was able to find a candle and some matches. After lighting a candle, my grandfather went to go check on his daughters. It was still dark since my grandfather's candle wasn't that bright, and my grandmother went to open the door because the lady was still knocking. My grandfather tried to feel the babies in what little light was provided by the candle. First, there was one who was crying. She calmed down a little while he continued to move his hand towards the second mat. There was nothing on the mat. My grandfather yelled at my grandmother to come help him search for the child. When she arrived, they saw that the baby had been dragged away from the mat. They noticed that the baby's body was pale, covered in bruises and bite marks. They also noticed that the baby had a brown liquid on her neck. They later learned that the brown liquid was the witch's saliva. My grandmother began to cry as she hugged her baby who had died. Ever since then she took all the precautions. She put some scissors in the shape of a cross under the baby's crib, a mirror next to the baby's crib, amaranth seeds on the roof of the house. She never forgot about that night. Had the neighbor not woken them up, my mother could have also died. The doctors couldn't find an explanation for the other child's death either. Story 2. Back in the 70s, my grandfather told me a lot of horror stories. There was no television in his time and they mostly listened to the radio. He made it clear to me that witches are real. Have you ever traveled through the state of Guanajuato? The people placed crosses in the hills to prevent witches from carrying out their rituals in those places. My grandfather told me that there was an abandoned ranch in Guanajuato back in 1907 near San Luis. The people saw that on certain nights witches would meet up. My grandfather and his friends, after a long night of partying and with the courage of alcohol running through their veins, they armed themselves and headed to the abandoned ranch. The bravest of his friends said that he would sleep inside the old house that overlooked the ranch. He took his shotgun and pistol, some candles and a crucifix. The others slept outside the house. Around 3 in the morning, they heard screams and wails coming from inside the house. Out of fear, none of them dared to move. It wasn't until dawn that they went inside the house and found their friend dead. He was covered in deep scratches as if some wild animal attacked him. He inadvertently stepped into a witch's coven. That is why he died a horrible death. That's why my grandfather firmly believes witches are real. Story 3. One day I decided to go on vacation with my wife, son, and 2 dogs to get away from the hustle and bustle of the city. I rented a cabin in the middle of a forest that is located towards San Miguelito in San Luis Potosí. The long-awaited day had arrived. We loaded the truck with all the things we would need to spend a wonderful weekend. We got into the truck and started on our way. We stopped at a supermarket to buy groceries so we would have something to eat in those days. We continued on our way until we began to enter a dirt road. After a while houses were becoming farther and fewer in between. We continued on our way. I stopped at a small shop that was located in the middle of nowhere to buy some cigarettes and a couple beers. A very friendly old man attended the store. He asked me where we were headed. I told him I rented a cabin that was in the nearby woods. The old man told me that if I was going to the witch's house, I laughed and said, "What witch's house?" He told me in that forest and in that house lived a witch who was burned by the townspeople a long time ago, but it was rumored that she was still around. I said goodbye to the man and started my way, thinking to myself, there are still people who believe in those things. When we made it to the cabin, we unpacked everything and settled in. I let the dogs out so they could run and enjoy the open space. A couple of hours later I took my dogs inside the house because it was getting dark outside and I didn't want the dogs to get lost. I closed all the windows and locked the doors and we prepared for bed, since we had planned to go to a nearby place the next day. Around 2 in the morning strange noises began to be heard outside. I got up and unleashed my dogs. I armed myself with whatever I could find and started looking for what was making those sounds. I searched and searched but couldn't find anything, but I could hear knocking on all the windows. It also sounded like if someone was running back and forth on the cabin roof. I went outside the house with my dogs and I could see some kind of giant bird moving from one side of the cabin to the other. I ran inside and told my wife that we needed to protect our child. I kept hearing the windows rattling and doors shaking violently. It suddenly went quiet and I heard a voice say,
"Let me in."
I began to hear a big commotion between my dogs and whatever was outside the house. It scared me so much that I couldn't bring myself to look outside and see what was going on. The night seemed to have lasted an eternity since the fighting never stopped. When the first rays of the sun broke through the dense forest, everything was completely quiet. After I gathered some courage, I left the cabin to see what happened. That's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. I saw the corpses of my dogs skinned and mutilated hanging from a tree. I ran back to the cabin and told my wife that we were getting the hell out of there. We got into the truck and went back home. Ever since then I never wanted to go back to small towns or forests. Story 4. I was 15 years old at the time and my younger brother was 8. We came back to our house around 11 at night after a celebration of a patron saint. Our mom was waiting for us at the door and scolded us for coming back so late. We were trying to explain our reason for being late. Suddenly our younger sister, who was a year and a half old, began to cry. A gust of wind could be heard pushing a door that leads to the kitchen inside the house. My mom became anxious, so much so that she told my dad to sprinkle water of St. Ignatius Loyola throughout the house before he went to work, covering both doors and windows. He finished the entire bottle that night. Around 12 in the morning, my brother and I went to bed. My mom, already in bed with our little sister, told us that she heard a very pitiful moaning outside. The weirdest thing about this is that we could hear 3 types of moaning: a middle-aged woman, an old woman and a child. These moans came and went as if they were cats hissing. Our mom tried to wake us up, but with no success. The room was practically shared. A fragile wooden door was the only thing that divided us. No matter what she tried, we never answered. After 2 hours my mother told us that the noises stopped on their own. My uncles who lived next door also managed to hear the cats squealing. That same afternoon, when I went to throw out the trash, I ran into 2 workers from an animal feed factory that was right behind our house. At the time our house didn't have any fences. It made it easier for them to get to their job by using the back of the home as a shortcut. The workers began to chat with me. They asked if I heard the noises from the previous night. I said no, but my mom heard everything. They told me that those weren't cats, those had been witches. They then told me that a small ball of fire was floating in the back corner of our house. Strange, considering that was where our room was located. That wasn't the only one. Another medium-sized and a larger-sized ball of fire were also circling around our house. They were able to see all this from a distance because when they were working, the lights suddenly went out. The workers quit shortly after and the factory even stopped having night shifts. To this day I wonder if they quit because of what they saw that night, or was it because of something else? Story 5. What I am about to tell you happened to me and some friends. I had always considered myself skeptical, but what happened to me changed my mind. I can assure you that the stories that are told about witches are real. This happened in a town near Querétaro. My friends and I went to a campsite. The campsite was half an hour away from the town by foot. When we arrived, we settled in. We spent the afternoon in a place surrounded by a couple of mountains with a very thick forest and a stream at the base of the mountains. When night came, we sat on some rocks that formed a small waterfall that led into the stream. We were doing some stargazing when we noticed a light on the hill in front of us. We turned off our flashlights, believing that they could be hunters or explorers. Contrary to the stories mentioned here, the light we saw wasn't a ball of fire, it looked blue. We quickly turned on a flashlight and there was suddenly 15 similar lights around the hill. The lights began to rapidly go up and down the hill with incredible speed. That's when we started to think that they were witches. One of my friends pulled out his switchblade and ran towards the town. We didn't see him until the next day. Those of us who stayed ran back to our tent that was about 10 meters from the stream. We were terrified but remained vigilant to whatever happened outside. It wasn't long before we began to hear female laughter that turned into cackling. It was as if they were mocking us. I couldn't believe what was happening, or rather I didn't want to believe. I was completely aware of what was happening. After a while the cackling stopped, and after feeling safer we fell asleep. The next morning we looked for footprints where we had seen the lights, but we found nothing. We quickly gathered our things and left that place as fast as we could. Story 6. In Arroyo Seco, Querétaro, little girls are not welcome, especially if they're still babies. Witches are in abundance and can be seen going from hill to hill at night. My aunt went on vacation to visit some family. She took my 3-year-old cousin. Ever since the girl arrived she couldn't sleep, she cried and cried. The last night they spent there. They were headed to bed and oddly enough the baby fell asleep. My aunt took the opportunity to get a good night's sleep. Suddenly out of nowhere she woke up and realized that the rosary she was wearing around her neck was broken. She tried to move but couldn't. She couldn't talk either. With much effort she turned her head to see the girl. To her absolute horror she saw someone, or something, dragging her baby out of the bed. She began to pray for the safety of her child so that God may protect her. After she finished praying, whispers and flapping of huge wings could be heard coming from the ceiling. She suddenly recovered her movement and she quickly grabbed the girl. She began to check if she was unharmed. She saw that the baby had bruises all over her body and noticed blood coming out of her belly button. The next day her family told her that witches were sucking her blood through her belly button. Story 7. Grandma versus Witch. This happened to me about 5 years ago when I lived in an old house. One day from out of nowhere for 5 days straight I heard scratching coming from the roof of the house, almost as if something was walking on it. The house itself was made from clay slabs and sheet metal, so you could hear the constant scratches on the metallic surfaces. After 5 days straight of this bullshit, at around 3 in the morning a lady began laughing in the most grotesque way. She would also sing and be off tune. Taylor Swift she was not. She was doing all this from the roof of our house. I was living with my grandma at the time. My grandma, who was a total badass, bravely stepped on the patio of the house and began insulting the thing. She picked up a broom and began poking at the tin roof as if she was wielding some type of spear. I stayed at the door because I was afraid and had no idea what was going on. My grandma ran back into the house and that thing began to scratch the roof with more intensity than before. We could see a shadow of a huge bird looming over. Suddenly out of nowhere my grandma began to groan in pain. Something was hurting her, but my grandma wouldn't stop banging on the sheet metal roof with her broom. Around 5 in the morning whatever was fighting grandma left us alone. I don't know when I fell asleep, but when I woke up my grandma told me that she dealt with a witch. And that's the story of how my grandma warded off a witch with a broom and some insults. There are days when I see my grandma sitting outside our new house holding a shotgun, almost as if she was waiting for someone, or something. Whoever wants to mess with grandma should be ready for a closed casket funeral. In fact, for the past few days I've been hearing some scratching noises coming from the roof of our new house, and grandma, well, let's just say she's been practicing her aim.